excited for today's episode, featuring none other than Major Wilson, the history buff himself. I'd like to start this episode as a reminder for about ocean safety, I should say. All right, get a life jacket. I know most of you don't use all of your uniform allowance on uniforms, so how about you put that money towards some safety equipment out in the ocean? Most of you act like you can fist fight Poseidon, but let me tell you, you can't. Get a life jacket. Be safe out there, people. All right, so our guest today is none other than the man, the myth, the legend, Major Wilson, the walking encyclopedia. So, sir, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, how long have you been in the MEB for, sir?
Just a little over 2 months now.
You enjoying it so far?
I am. It's awesome. Sense of urgency is great. Teamwork. I'm really having a blast. This is everything I wanted at this point in my career, and following on from the school I was at before this, it's exactly what I was looking for. So, yes, I'm having a blast.
So where were you at before this, sir?
I was at the School of Advanced Warfighting, and then prior to that, I was a faculty advisor at Expeditionary Warfare School, so 3 years in Quantico in the education realm.
And do you like living on a tropical island so far?
I'm having a blast. I love it. This is another thing that I wanted. I've been primarily on the 29 Palms, Virginia circuit for the past couple years, so looking for a change of pace and just kind of learning what's going on out here and seeing Okinawa. Never been here before, never did a deployment out here. Just it's been a place that I've heard of but haven't experienced till now.
And so what do you do in the MEB, sir?
I'm a planner in the future operations section, so I could bore you with details, but I make plans, and then the plans get put into execution, or they get rejected, depending on the quality.
Do you have a family here, sir?
I do. I have my wife, 4 children, and another one due in January.
You have 4 children? Sir, I had no idea.
Yes, 4 kids and another one coming.
So for those who don't know Major Wilson, he has a positive attitude every time I meet him, which I don't know how he does with both a strong job in the 3rd MEB and 4 kids and another one on the way.
That's right. I'm positive because I have so many kids.
Yeah?
It's impossible to be anything but positive when you got so many kids running around.
You know, I can have a few parents on. I can get called up right now that would argue with you. But I was about to ask you, so what's your secret to a positive attitude? It's the kids? The kids
yes,
keep you?
Absolutely.
All right. And where are you originally from in the States, sir?
I'm from Gibbon, Nebraska.
Gibbon.
Yes.
What a name.
Yep.
All right. Yeah.
We'll cover it. We'll get to its name in the history.
Oh,
lesson.
You got a history too, sir?
That's right.
All right. So, coming from Nebraska again to a tropical island, do you have the same activities that you enjoyed in Nebraska here, or do you have something new here?
Well, I can't shoot guns. And that's pretty much all you do. All we can do in Nebraska. There's 10 cows for every 1 person per square mile where I live, and when you open the front door on my parents' or my in-laws' house, you don't see any other houses for miles. So
that's the dream.
Yeah.
So here, what do you enjoy doing then?
We've been to the beaches. We've been to Akuma. We went to Ieshima over Labor Day. That was fantastic, just for the tranquility of the beach and. Like I said, mostly 29 Palms and Virginia, so being around the ocean we haven't been stationed anywhere, on the water, so that's been a lot of fun for us. But that's been our primary thing, is that and just getting familiarity with the island, getting moved in and putting the house together, mowing my yard because I have a corner section and I have 2 acres of yard to mow, so... Which I enjoy, being from Nebraska.
Get one of those 4 kids to do it.
We're getting there. We're getting there.
How old are your kids, if you don't mind me asking?
9, 7, 5, and 2.
Oh, yeah, perfect age.
Yep.
Perfect age for, get the lawnmower.
That's right.
So now we're introducing the topic for this podcast, which we're ideally going to do 4 podcasts total over because you just got that much knowledge in that head of yours, sir. This podcast will cover history, and we're going to start out with discovering Greeks and Romans. Is that correct, sir?
Yep.
All right. So I just want to ask this real quick. How have you become so knowledgeable about history?
Well, let me start with my 2 ground rules for these podcasts, if you don't mind.
Okay.
All right. Number 1, I'm not going to let any facts get in the way of a good story.
All right.
And number 2, I'd say that I'm much more of a student than I am a scholar or an academic or a person that's well educated in these things. I'm interested in them, so I read about them, and I'm trying to learn and put pieces together. But I think, part of it is just my education growing up. My parents were adamant about our education. They read to us every day, so I always kind of had an interest in history for whatever reason. And then I just see so many things that still harken back to that kind of history of antiquity. I mean, Semper Fidelis, for example, that's Latin. That's an extinct language. That's a language of the Romans. Why do we still use this extinct language for our motto instead of just saying always faithful? And so some of those questions, that they're part of it's searching for answers, and part of it's fascination. Part of it is, I think, probably the biggest part is I think it's a professional responsibility for someone in my position to be well versed in history. History is really the fundamental subject that a planner can study to try and discern or see patterns. I think General Mattis said once, he said he's never been surprised by anything that he's seen on the battlefield, and part of that, part of his ability to say something like that is because of how much time he dedicated to studying history, to trying to recognize patterns. And then there's another famous General Mattis story about a strike that he approved in Iraq at one point, where there was civilians being used as shields against an Iraqi position. I think it was a hospital. I don't remember all the details of it, but the point of it was, it took him. I think it took him 30 seconds to approve that strike, and someone said to him, "How could you approve it so quickly?" He said something to the effect of it. You think it took me 30 seconds. I think it took me 30 years to develop my mind to be able to make a decision like that. So that's part of. I think that's where I'm at in life right now, and where I've got to. That's the primary reason behind such study. But it's always been a fascination, even before the Marine Corps was part of a picture for me. So
you'd say like knowing history kind of makes people better Marines.
I think there's an absolute correlation between study of history, study of campaigns, study of the great captains of history, and being an effective planner and an effective decision maker. Mm-hmm. But there's also innumerable other qualities that come in on the individual besides just a knowledge of history that lead to their ultimate effectiveness as a leader and as a Marine.
Understandable. So, by the way, you mentioned that we still use Latin. Why is that, by the way?
I couldn't answer that question for you.
Just had me curious there.
I think that my thought of it is that the Roman legions and their dominance of Europe and of the Mediterranean for so long, and our connection to the connection to kind of that as a foundation for systems of government, systems of civilization that still have, I can't think of the word, but I mean, you still see them in our system of government today, because it's not just the Marine Corps that uses Latin. I mean, you look at E pluribus unum is the first Latin quote maybe that you can find, and has nothing to do with the military, but everything to do with the idea of America and the government, but where we as a nation kind of pull our ancestry from, insofar as the idea of how the government should operate.
That's a better answer than, I just think it sounds cool, which would be usually mine.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get started. So you said you wanted to begin this session off by talking about Homer and the, oh my God, am I going to pronounce this right? Iliad?
The Iliad.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. So start with Homer. It's a difficult read. It's an epic poem. And so it's it's not a book that necessarily speaks to you when you read it. For me, I'll read a book, I'll read about a book, but when references continue to come up and things that I'm studying, that's kind of how I pick my topics. And Homer's an interesting one, because it's really, the story of the story is that there's this blind old poet in 650-ish BC, somewhere between 800 and 650 BC. Mm-hmm. At that time, there's just the budding starts of a written language insofar as what we recognize today, where letters make sounds and sounds make words and words influence thought. Of course, there's hieroglyphics, and there's drawings, and there's symbols that have been used to communicate in a written form before that. But really, this is the first book written in kind of the Mediterranean era, and it's a book about war. And the book itself is about an amphibious assault, something that's important to Marines, and it's about an amphibious assault across the Aegean Sea. It starts almost, towards the end. The book starts towards the end of the assault itself, when the Greeks, really Spartans and Mycenaeans, and I forget all the different terms that they use, but folks from Greek peninsula assault across the sea to Troy. They've established their lodgment, but they have been unable for 9+ years to get into Troy itself. And there's been battles on the shore, and there's been revolts, and there's been all the things that can happen across that period of conflict. The central character really for Homer is this man that is almost a god, Achilles. And the book itself, I think there's a lot of familiarity with it, but there's Achilles, and Achilles is almost invincible except for this place on the back of his foot that his mother's thumb was on when she dipped him in the river Styx, and all this mythological stuff. Achilles, though, he's a leader. He is a warrior. He is someone that Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks, needed to fight with him in order to have a chance in Troy. Sounds simple enough, but the story is really in depth about the emotions and what's communicated in that book more than anything, more than tactics, more than anything you're going to learn about the conduct of war, is what war does to an individual and what war does to people and what impacts it has, and the emotions it conjures up in men and women when they're in these environments, good, the best and the worst of human beings. And that's really the first book. And that book becomes the foundation for the Greek society, and it becomes the example of, what an education is your ability to read, interpret, and discuss this book. Ideas like math and science and social studies and all these other things that that we're all familiar with from our educations, those ideas are still 1,000, 1,500 years away from that being what is considered an education. At this time, an education is understanding Homer and discussing Homer, and some of those ideas in this book. Keep in mind, this predates Christianity. This predates Islam. The Hebrew God is still a kind of a nascent thing, and that's occurring well away from Greece, still in the Mediterranean, but kind of isolated in areas between Egypt and Jerusalem. So the predominant idea about any kind of deity is this polytheistic. There's gods that control certain things, and there's this world of gods that are influencing the fate of men. And so in the book itself, it talks a lot about some of the topics itself: honor, hubris, rage, the idea of warriors coming home, pride, glory, fate being probably the biggest one. And Homer uses this book and this battle of Troy. That's not a lot is known about it and how it actually went down versus what Homer wrote. It's hard to tell how much truth is in it, but the ideas that he expressed there really start to influence the thought process of these people in this part of the world. So that's like 650-ish BC is when they kind of think that this book was written down and started to be used. So we'll fast forward to 490 BC, Marathon. So Marathon, we still talk about marathons. People run marathons. You see 26.2 on the back of people's car all the time. What is marathon? Where did it come from? How did this distance get decided upon? So there's this battle in 490 BC, and it's Marathon. And it's the Greeks, but it's against the Persian army or the Persian Empire at this time. So you have this world that has been united in the Syria, Iraq, Iran, really centralized on present-day Iran, this world has been united, and they're conquering everything, and they're moving west. And as they move west, they're subjecting different populations and different peoples to their empire, and you pay a tax, and you have a governor in place. They call them satraps, but you have some sort of leadership from the empire and placed over you. They tell you how you're going to do things. You pay the taxes, and then you go about life, and everything's working out well for Xerxes, and he's moving west, and then eventually stumbles upon the Greeks again, and they say, no, we're not going to do that. And Xerxes, in this battle, it's actually another amphibious assault. He'd landed on these plains outside of this town of Marathon, and the Greeks marched out, and they met him in battle. They're outnumbered, but the unique thing about this battle is it was the first kind of, I'll call it, the books call it East and West. Sometimes that's just a little bit too abstract of an idea to talk about these two cultures clashing, but what you have is you really do have a war of cultures, and you have these ideas in Greece that are kind of nascent again, and they're starting to evolve about the value of the individual, how much each person is worth. Are they worth equal, or are some people born of a higher higher class, a higher stature than others? And really, where the idea in Greece is that it's more moving towards this idea of equality, that everybody is born equal, everybody is equal to an effect, and it's what they do with themselves that changes a interpretation of their value, as opposed to where Xerxes, he's God of gods, King of kings, men of men is his title, and he is the ruler of everything. He brings together his army, and they meet at Marathon. And really, Marathon, it's a 3-day battle. But what's unique about Marathon, and what's worth remembering about Marathon, is kind of two things. First is just the tactics, and this is where the Xerxes armies, there's some dispute about this. What I've read about it's kind of one of the historians that I really appreciate his work. He's a professor at MCU. He wrote a book about this, and a big point he made on this was the tactics were as simple as, instead of just marching at the pace that the Persians had anticipated, that they'd set their fire support, which is really their archers. They'd pick some lines, and their archers knew if they started firing their arrows at a certain point when the Greeks were a certain distance away, based off the pace at which the Greeks marched, that they would be able to devastate them before they even got within sword distance. Mm-hmm. And the Greeks, instead of just sticking to that and sticking to what they were drilled to, they had the courage to start running towards the battle. And so that the archers, the Persian archers, were just completely ineffective, and the Greeks were able, through courage and through their esprit de corps, mm-hmm. they were able to push the Persians back into the sea, and they won that battle. It didn't end Xerxes. It didn't end that whole affair. But what it did do is it kept Greece in a position to determine for themselves how they're going to move forward. And that's very important in the next 100, 200 years of their history. That's Marathon. That's the first class. But what we're really familiar with is Thermopylae in 480. So 10 years after this first clash.
So I have a question. So that running distance, right?
Yes.
Is that what contributes to the distance for what a marathon is?
There's a runner. There's a whole story about it. But yes, there was a lookout, and they saw the Persian fleet, and they anticipated where they were going to land, and they ran back to, I believe, Athens. It might have been another city though, but I believe it was Athens. Mm-hmm. And the legend is the runner, upon the runner's arrival, he passed the word that the Persians were landing at Marathon, and then he died. He collapsed from exhaustion, and he died. But his warning gave the Greeks enough time to sally forth to meet that force at Marathon before they'd really projected their combat power ashore, established their lodgment, were able to resupply, and all these things that we still talk about being critical aspects of how we conduct amphibious operations were just as pertinent to the Persians at that time as they were to us. We just, we did the big Korea planning exercise a couple weeks ago, and that's always a huge discussion about when you're going to conduct an amphibious assault is you got to get that initial lodgment on the beachhead, and then how much logistics do you bring ashore? How do you keep yourself in a position to project power without culminating? And going back to history and talking about why it's important to study history is this idea of culmination after an amphibious assault. Well, here's an example of it, and that you can study different amphibious assaults, and the more that you study and the more ideas that you and the more examples that you see, the more you can start to see the trends and the patterns, and when one was successful, what factors were involved, both from a friendly and an enemy standpoint that we can attribute to its success, versus when one fails, what factors do we think caused the failure? This is, like we were talking about, this is an example here of one that failed that's worth taking note of.
So I had no idea that was the term that created a marathon, or is the origin of the word marathon. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Any history about 5Ks? I'm kidding. All right. So you said we're getting to Athens.
Well, we're getting to Thermopylae, to the Spartans, the 300, one of our favorites that we enjoy discussing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Marines are kind of like pride themselves in kind of having ties to Spartan culture. One of my favorite books that was lended to me by shout out to Master Sergeant Tony Welch. He gave me my favorite book from the Commandant's reading list is the Warrior's Ethos, and you and me have talked about this before this, about comparing. It compares Marine culture to Spartan culture, and it's fascinating. How much we apply. Again, we're talking about this in length, or through what you've just discussed, but how much ancient history, again, stuff that predates Christ, is still applicable today. As you were talking about, Homer and the Iliad, would you also say that its accuracy is probably one of the reasons that, its accuracy in some places, especially how we feel about war, about, the hubris about war. Is that one of the reasons it's lasted for such a long time? It's still something that's being talked today. It's being made into movies. And,
yeah, that's right.
And brought up in discussions about, war now. Would you say that's probably the big contributing factor why it still exists?
I think that's a big reason. It was the first, and for a long time it was, the only thing that was available to read. And if now, one of my favorite things I've ever heard about cell phones is that we walk around with all the information the world's ever known in our hand, and we watch videos of cats with it, and that just wasn't available back then.
I agree. And what's sad is I'm one of those people that's like, I love history, but I'm a lazy history buff because, again, it's so easy for us to access the knowledge, and any Marine should be encouraged to look at this kind of history in order to better themselves.
Yeah, and I think, now that I've thought about it a little bit, whether or not it's accurate, it's at least it's a common thing that people can discuss. And I think for a long time, just having a common thing to discuss, whether you're discussing it or whether you're arguing, yes, this is accurate, or you're saying, no, it's not because of these reasons, but that common book or that common idea that is shared among people, and then their opinions that form from it, I think is one of the things that made it pertinent then. And because it was the first, you got to think the ideas that have come from it are just derivatives of that very first idea. Sometimes we may not recognize that they're a derivative, but like I talked about, fate, glory, homecoming, pride, honor, hubris, rage. We have a line of effort in our campaign plan that talks about resiliency, and what resiliency is, how do we build it, how do we understand it, how does it make us more combat effective, but how does it make us not just better at our jobs and better Marines and more proficient in our ability to accomplish our mission, how does it make us people with strong souls that can recognize the difference between the violence that may be required versus the humanity that may be required in different missions. And I listened to General Ellison when he was on your podcast. I think he talked at length about that, because in the MEB we have very specific missions across that entire continuum, whether it's JTF 505, where, we're going forward to go into an environment where our sacrifices are to help people in distress caused by, natural occurrences, not caused by hubris, not caused by rage, not caused by, some of these factors of war, but caused by things outside of anybody's control. And we're going forward there to, to help them. And then on the other side of it, and other missions that we're assigned to, it may be the most cataclysmic battle that the world's ever seen, or at least the most important one for defining the future of our society for the next century. And we have to be prepared we have to be able to discuss and to think about and to prepare our minds for the sacrifices and the decisions that may come with that. And then, again, going back to history, I'm talking about Homer, I'm talking about Marathon, and Marathon was one of those same kind of battles that the Greeks faced. It was a question of whether or not their way of life was going to be able to stand up against this alternative idea that has power and it has capability and it has a desire to, potentially extinguish or diminish that way of life. And those are things that we still deal with to this day. And I think while we're on the topic, I'd like to, I listened to both General Ellison's and Master Gunnery Sergeant Leander's, and both of them talked about JTF 505 and talked about what the MEB does, and it was just, it's an incredible organization. And when we look back to the relief efforts in Nepal, I wasn't a part of the MEB there then. I was, somewhere else in the Marine Corps doing other things. But a guy I grew up with, a couple small towns away from me, good friend with my brother-in-law in college, knew him in college. He was one of the pilots in that Huey that crashed, and I went to his funeral. So it was, his funeral is back in the Great Plains. He's buried on a hilltop on the prairie back in Nebraska. And at his funeral, Nepal sent a delegation, and it was one of those moments in life where, you're doing the right thing by being a part of this organization, being a part of the Marine Corps. This Nepalese delegation came, and it was after the funeral, and they just asked to speak at this little reception that the family had. And this gentleman from Nepal, he just said, when the earthquake started happening, we were appealing to everybody for help, and we asked India for help, we asked all these other countries for help, and they did what they could, but it was just such a tragic situation. And his words, I'll never forget his words, because it was, and then the Marines showed up, and we knew that we were going to get help, and the Marines did everything they possibly could to help us out. And then, it was just fate that brought me to that, to Dusty Lukasavich is his name, but we grew up in the same area. We knew each other in college. He was determined to be a Marine officer. He's determined to be a pilot, and him and the rest of that crew gave the ultimate sacrifice. And then I'm back home, in Nebraska. It's not a big Marine area. It's a very patriotic area, but there's not, it's just not a place that there's a lot of Marines. There's no bases. There's no infrastructure. There's nothing that, the ambiance of being around the Marine Corps with jets in the overhead and and helicopters all over the place and machine guns in the background and artillery shooting, like what you grow up with that on 29 Palms, and that's just the ambiance of the place. And in Nebraska, it's kind of the opposite. It's the quiet. But his squadron came out there, and his squadron did a flyover of the funeral, and so they're standing on that prairie in the middle of the country, paying respects to a friend of mine that gave the ultimate sacrifice to help another nation out from a natural disaster, and then the warbirds flying over. It was just a very powerful moment that I'll never forget. That I've talked about it before, but it's one of those moments that that you experience. That it's like, yes, I know everything that we're doing and everything that we are is for good, and that everybody that wears this uniform when we're together, it's just we care about each other and we care about the mission, and we're willing to do what it takes to accomplish that. So,
you were saying earlier that your positivity comes from just your kids, but with that mindset, I think a lot of Marines need to hear that, because a lot of Marines sometimes question, are they making a difference? Are they making a change in the world?
Yeah.
And knowing that is a huge thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why it's important to communicate. I mean, it's incumbent on leaders to articulate that and to find a message that works. And, maybe part of this podcast, it helps out too, because they were talking about warriors, and that I'm trying to draw the connection, and I'll try to continue, but I know it's kind of hard with this antiquity stuff, but that it's, it's not just us now doing this, that it's a legacy, it's a global history of people like us, and 3,000 years from now, there'll still be people like us, and hopefully, the contributions we've made have been for the better and have set conditions for, whether it's 3,000 or 30 years from now, or 10 years from now, or, or whatever it may be. And I think that's kind of one of the conclusions I've come to at this stage in my career and the length of time that I've been in, is that a lot of what we're doing, especially as a future operations planner, how I have to think and what I have to do with these plans, will never manifest themselves potentially with anything that I do, but I'm setting conditions for someone to take the plan and improve the plan until it's time to fight the plan, and that the work we've put into it and that the efforts that have put in they're not going to eliminate nature of war. And the nature of war is fear and uncertainty and fluidity and human dynamics and all those things that we discussed. It's not going to eliminate it. Ideally, it just creates an advantage for the people that are executing to cope with those things, so that they can seize opportunities on the battlefield, and they're able to accomplish the mission in the best manner possible.
Mm-hmm.
But studying history too, again, is part of that, because I think that especially in this past year, with the School of Advanced Warfighting is mostly a history-oriented school, but we really study history in a way that helps us see how we got to where we're at now, and somewhat predict an arc that we're on, or at least predict the parameters with which the future can unfold for us. We're not going to solve all the problems. We're not going to be able to all of a sudden wake up one day and say, here's the solution to all the ills. We're just going to be able to better cope with them. And ideally, our ability to cope with them is the factor that allows us to achieve our objectives with anything that we undertake.
So I'm going to have a hard time back to the Spartans.
Well, if you were a Spartan in 480 BC and Leonidas said, we're only taking 300 of you guys and we're going to fight 1,000,000 because we have this idea that we don't want to give up our way of life.
Mm-hmm.
Why do Marines like Spartans? Because we're an organization where Leonidas' big problem would be cutting it down to just 300 and preserving the rest of them in the reserve for the killing blow.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we like the Spartans. I mean, the first battalion I was in was 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, the Spartan Battalion.
Mm-hmm.
It's been the Spartan Battalion, I don't know, for a long time. It's had a pretty distinguished list of commanding officers, to include Brigadier General Ellison was the CO there as well. But so we were, Gates of Fire was a big book that we read. It's just a fantastic book. That's the first time while we were deployed, I saw that book, and it's about Thermopylae, and it's about King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. I watched every Marine in my platoon over the course of 2 months read that book, and once they all read it and that became the topic of conversation, I don't even have the words to describe the pride that they started to draw between the Spartans, the Spartan Battalion, the Marine Corps, and their contributions in a far-flung land to protect the interests that our country deemed worth protecting. And it was just a really neat thing. And it was funny because we deployed right before the what was the movie 300 with that graphic.
Yeah, with God, is it Russell Crowe?
No,
it wasn't
no,
Russell
not
Crowe.
Russell Crowe. He was Gladiator.
No.
That was like 500
Oh
years
yeah,
past
you're
that.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
God,
300 was a movie,
yeah,
though, right?
basically where it was like overdone with,
Yes.
with like a whole bunch of effects and
Yeah.
yeah. God, it's gonna kill me if I don't know.
That movie came out right before we deployed. So the battalion commander, it was Major General Mullen. He retired last year. He was our battalion commander, but he took all the staff NCOs and officers to that movie. But the movie also made its rounds as well. So it was kind of funny because the battalion commander on Battalion TAC 1 is supposed to be Spartan 6, but every now and then when Marines would hear him on TAC 1, you'd hear Leonidas, or when he was coming out to our position, the Marines started referring to the battalion commander as Leonidas because he was Spartan 6. He was a leader of the battalion, so it was really funny. But yeah, I mean, that was 2007, and we're talking about something that happened in 480 BC, like it happened yesterday. Like, oh yes, we're Spartans. We were there. We were, we would have, yeah. I mean, a million Persians bearing down on us, no problem. Thermopylae, though, that came from Xerxes' second attempt in there, and I mean, there were 300 Spartans there. There was more than 300 though. I mean, there was about 700 to 1,000 other Greeks that stood with them. But the Spartans at this time, the Spartans were the prime warfighters in ancient Greece, and they had a really unique system. There was not everybody in Sparta was a Spartan. You were kind of born into Spartans, and they had slaves. They called them helots that managed the farms and that did a lot of work and that really ran the infrastructure so that the Spartans could train all the time. And that's what set them apart, is that they trained more than anybody else.
How long would they typically train for? Like, I know it's from like boyhood to adulthood, but how many years was that usually?
So I don't remember exactly, but I mean there was if you didn't look strong as a baby, you were cast in the woods. So you can almost say that the training started then, but then at like early adolescence, the young men were separated from the families. They're put in a kind of a communal area. They were assigned a mentor that was older than them, and I think they trained in that realm until they're like 18, 19 years old, and then they joined I think the term translates to a mess. I may be wrong on that, but they joined a group that was basically a squad, and then they were in the squad, forever. And based off of family status and some other things, they could elevate, or they could stay, they could stay in the same position or the same kind of the same formation. And the tactic of the time was the Phalanx, where everybody was shoulder to shoulder, and your right hand had a sword in it, your left hand had a shield in it, and the shield wasn't, in the Spartan realm, the shield wasn't for you. The shield was for the person to your left to cover them. And so it was, I mean, they drilled together constantly, and the idea of this selflessness and fighting for one another, that's a kind of a predominant theme in the Spartan legacy. But the fact that they didn't have to work any fields, they didn't have to, they saw their only job as Spartans was to prepare for battle. That was one of the unique things that set them apart. They're just so much more well drilled than everybody else. But to oppose the Persians, there's only, 5,000-ish Spartans at any given time. Maybe not even that many. Sparta is, it's a territory in the Peloponnesian Peninsula that's part of Greece. It's not a very big area, and it's a town. So all these, there weren't states back then. There were kind of city-state type things. Each city had its own idea of government or form of government, and Athens and Sparta were the two big ones. And Athens was really the focus on democracy and more political, whereas Sparta was much more militaristic. But to oppose the Persians, all the Greek states knew that they needed the Spartans to fight with them. Sparta they only sent 300, and this is a kind of a Paul Harvey and the rest of the story type thing the more you read about it, because these 300 that they sent, part of the reason they only sent 300 is because if they send all the Spartans at any given time, they're afraid that their helots were going to revolt back home. So there was some kind of self-licking ice cream cone almost because of their way of life that forced them into that decision. But they sent the 300. King Leonidas led the Greeks at Thermopylae. They lost the battle, but they didn't lose the war. They were able to slow Xerxes down enough that another battle that occurred at sea, the Battle of Salamis, and so now you have this Greek land army that delayed on land long enough that Xerxes is now again starting to worry about his culminating point from both a logistical aspect, but also from how much longer he could hold together this federation of indentured people that he's pressed into military service. And he's gone around the coast, so he's gone up north and then back down south around the Aegean Sea on land to attack Greece this time. But he has a fleet that's trailing along with him, and his fleet is his lifeline. That's his sea line of communication in this battle. And at Salamis, what the Greeks had been doing is they just used their fleet as a blockade. So instead of going out and taking offensive action against Xerxes' fleet, they've really just tried to prevent the fleet from entering into the harbors that would threaten Athens. And then they change their mind about that, and they decide, no, we need to conduct offensive action. If we destroy Xerxes' fleet, he'll be in a dilemma at this point. They pull back from their blockade into kind of this, what we would consider key maritime terrain, is another term that we use quite often around here, and lured Xerxes' fleet into this area where, despite its numerical superiority, their ability to employ themselves or deploy the fleet to its maximum combat potential was very limited by the terrain and advantageous to the Greeks. And then the Greeks end up destroying Xerxes' fleet, and at that point the second attack into Greece has culminated by the Persians, and Greece maintains their way of life. So what did they do with that? Well, about 50 years after that, since they're safe from Persia, Greece decides to go to war with each other, and Sparta and Athens go to war, and that's the Peloponnesian War, and that's kind of 431 BC. So Thucydides writes this book about the Peloponnesian War that's really famous.
So what causes the divide between the Greeks and the Athens? Am I right? Say that right?
Right.
Yeah. What causes the divide between them?
That's interesting. Thucydides, he witnesses this. He is he's alive for the majority of this. But he's kind of in jail for a lot of it, and he writes the book 20 years later. And the punchline from Thucydides is that it's fear, honor, and interest, and it's the fear, honor, and interest of a city and of a state that leads to conflict. It was the balance of power on the Greek peninsula at this point between Athens and Sparta, and the alliances that Sparta was starting to put together. Athens was concerned because they're two completely, although they're both Greek and they're both on this, geographically close to one another, they're completely different ways of life between the two states. Like we talked about, I mean, in Sparta, you are a Spartan or you're a helot, and if you're a helot, you're a slave. And in Athens, they're struggling with these ideas. But Athens, there's an idea of democracy and of elected leadership and of equality among men. Women, it was not equality among people; it was equality among men. And they still did not treat women on a standard that we would consider civil at this day and age. But the discussion on equality is center most to Athens, and they have a form of government. They collect taxes, they vote on taxes, how people are taxed, how much any person is going to contribute to the city it's a matter of public discourse and the decision making is a matter of public discourse, and they have a kind of an elective body, but they also have leaders that guide the city at this point. And so, Thucydides says fear, honor, and interest. So part of it is Athenian fear of Spartan hegemony. Part of it is is honor of maintaining their own way of life, and part of it is their interests in their economic means to construct a form of government and a system of defense that allows them to satisfy those things. And it's between the two countries, or between these two cities. But it's this is a 30-year conflict, and it's just an epic conflict of battles, not just battles of Spartans and Atha, but battles of alliances and intrigues and deployments to, at one point, kind of the culminating point, the battles are actually taking place in Sicily, completely off the Greek peninsula, and there's just these epic discourses on what the rights of a state are, what the reasons for a state are, what the rights of a person are, and throughout this, there's evolutions and there's iterations and there's changes in forms of maneuver that are really fascinating as well. Sparta is a land army with a very minuscule, ineffectual navy. Athens is predominantly a naval power with a minimal army. In fact, Athens' initial operational their initial operation is just to build a wall. Build a wall, pull everybody into Athens from the outlying areas, build a wall to keep the Spartans out. We've got a better navy than they do, so our economic interests and our navy will allow us to preserve our way of life. Kind of backfires because they pull everybody in, and then a plague breaks out in Athens, and people start dying, and they're getting irritated, so they have to, and it's not working the way that they anticipated. So then they have to go to battle. And you would think, that one side would use their strengths against the other's weaknesses, and it's just there's some epic stories in there. The Athenians land on the coast that's closest to Sparta, and the Spartans actually, instead of fighting, go out to sea, and so the Athenians have a lodgment near Sparta, and the Spartans are now conducting amphibious assaults, which is their weakness, to get the Athenians off the off the peninsula and back to Athens. And like I said, alliances, dialogues, there's famous quotes, all sorts of famous quotes from the book, but it eventually turns into this campaign in Sicily, near the Italian peninsula. And I read the book. I'm not smart enough to interpret everything in the book. I would say I looked at every word in it, but what stuck out from me when I was reading about that book that was fascinating about the campaign in Sicily is that the Athenians could never put together a coherent campaign plan because they never knew from one year to the next what they were going to get from the government insofar as funding. So all their ideas that they had to make assumptions about how they were going to be funded, but because they could never put together anything coherent, it allowed the Spartans and their allies to build a better plan and to execute a better plan against the Athenians. You're smiling. You got something?
Yeah,
to say?
no. All I'm thinking is, I'm in G8, so I'm like, funding.
Yeah, exactly.
Funding wins war. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
Be nice to your local G8 and
Yeah, Athens
G8
lost
Marine.
because they couldn't get the cross-FY travel
They
figured out in
couldn't.
time.
Athens would have won if they submitted their voucher correctly.
Yeah, I know. Yep. Yeah. So we're laughing about it, but
But it's true. Like that kind of logistic stuff is sometimes like defines war.
Well, and if you think that if your idea of government is a level of freedom, or at least a level of decision making that is arbitrated by the collective people that are of the country that runs that government, and that it's their decision on, do I want to win this war, or do I want to pay less taxes? And you as that's a societal decision. Is that form of government viable in the long term or in the short term. And in the short term, it's interesting because when you ask who won the Peloponnesian War, well, Sparta won the Peloponnesian War. The totalitarian militaristic government actually defeated the Athenians that were America. Our form of government takes much more from Athens than it does from Sparta.
Mm-hmm.
But in the long term, I read a book a couple weeks ago by a pretty renowned historian, and in the long term, Athens survived longer than Sparta did. Sparta is this idea, and there's aspects of Sparta that are useful to us as Marines that we can identify with as being the warrior select for our society. But writ large, the ideas from Athens survived much longer than the Spartans did.
Mm-hmm.
The Spartans had about, I think I got it written down here, some time between about 404 BC, I think it was about 380-ish BC, so 20 plus years after this, the Spartans lose a battle to the Thebans, and this very dynamic leader that's kind of lost on history because there's only one real primary source.
You don't really hear a lot about the downfall of Sparta as much as like the actual like golden age of like Sparta.
So Epaminondas in the Battle of Lutra is kind of one of the areas you can consider the downfall of Sparta. So they have this society, but this society kind of starts to implode on itself. Too militaristic, too totalitarian, too predicated on classes to where there's so much animosity among the population, and then there's just some aspects of becoming soft when you don't have a challenge. So Epaminondas, I think he's a Theban. There's this Battle of Lutra, and this one's almost like marathon, where it's one of those battles in history where just a subtle change of tactics provided such an unanticipated threat to one side that they just crumbled. All Epaminondas did was he put more people on one of his, they have the Phalanx, everybody gets in a line, they get shoulder to shoulder, they crash into each other, and they're stabbing and gouging and slicing, and I mean, it is the most visceral combat that you can imagine. And instead of having an equal line across, Epaminondas just weights one side with, he just makes it much, much deeper so that when the two lines meet, this one side that's been weighted crashes through the Spartan lines and is able to attack them along a flank and destroy them. Mm-hmm. Sounds subtle, sounds simple enough, but at the time it was world changing.
Subtle change. Look at Shaka Zulu, who his tactics was what was it called, the bull's head, and he just shortened his spears to basically knives. Simple changes, and he overthrew the British Empire at the time.
That's right.
Subtle changes can win wars.
Yep, and that's what happened. And that's what happened here. And there was about a decade that Epaminondas was a leading man of Greece. There's a book called The Soul of Battle. I read that in high school, and it was kind of an interesting book because the author's take on that, he took Epaminondas, Sherman, and Patton, and he compared those three people and their forms of government and the ideals of their government and how they led and how those influenced how they led their formations and how they were able to achieve all that they achieved based off of the ideals of a government. So that was the first time I'd ever heard of him. I studied him a little bit, but there's really not a whole lot about him. But that's kind of the battle that I understand is the really that put the Spartans back into just a city-state within kind of the Greek world at that point instead of the leader of the Greek world. Mm. So just backing up a little bit, what I've found fascinating is during this Peloponnesian War, there's this guy living in Athens, and his name's Socrates. And maybe he's another guy. Maybe he's real. Maybe he's not. He's this old dude that seems to do nothing but like sit around on people's porches and ask questions, like we were talking out in the alley. I always enjoyed the comment about him that he was considered the wisest man in the world because the only thing he knew is he knew nothing, and that's really kind of a powerful. If you really think about it, I mean, I'd read that, read that once and then forgot it, and then read it again when I was an instructor at Expeditionary Warfare School, and I thought, man, if I just go and interact with the students every day like I know nothing, we're going to get so much more done because we're going to learn from each other. And when I'm presented with a plan, I know nothing about what they were thinking about this plan. I gave them some guidance, but if I'm just, if I approach this with just this fascination and this curiosity, I'm going to ask better questions, and I'm going to learn more about what I need to know instead of approaching it with kind of the attitude of I know where this needs to go and it needs to go a certain way. But that's, not to sidetrack too much, Socrates is there and he views the Peloponnesian War firsthand. One of his most famous students is Plato. Plato's born about the time the Peloponnesian War starts. Plato becomes a student of Socrates post-Peloponnesian War, and there's all these dialogues and all this structure of philosophy and questions and logic and what is ideal, what is a virtue, all these ideas in this kind of golden age of Greece that are occurring between Socrates and Plato. And then Plato's student is this guy named Aristotle, and Aristotle takes and he doesn't. It's not that he disputes Platonic logic, but he builds upon it. He takes ideas in new directions, like a good student should. He's not just parroting what his teacher told him. He's taking the ideas that his teacher told him, and he's examining them, and he's refining them, and he's writing about them, and they're influencing. They still influence thought in the in across the world, but especially I'd say in the kind of the European American Western canon of literature. So Aristotle, he's a pretty good teacher. So this king in Macedon named Philip, who's starting to turn that place into a juggernaut or an empire, has him come teach his son. His son's name's Alexander. And so...
Would you say Alexander's a great guy?
Alexander the Great. The Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is being taught by Aristotle. And they're taking the things that they've witnessed in this Peloponnesian conflict, the recent history in the battles with Persia, whether it was Thermopylae or Marathon, but they all examine them in the view of this epic written by Homer, 300 years before this. Homer is still, and Homer's ideas are still the foundation for examination of these things. And so that's what Aristotle is. I speculate on it, but that's how he's teaching Alexander the Great. And Alexander is so convinced of these things that Alexander actually has a family tree drawn up that says that he is a descendant of Achilles, the hero, the hero from Homer. And Alexander thinks of himself as a great man, a descendant of the gods, a descendant of this warrior class.
Sounds like a real humble guy.
Yes. Well, I mean, what do humble guys like that do? They round up an army and they try to take over the world to the extent of the empire. He wants to find the edge of the world, and he wants to make it all part of his empire. And I've read a book a couple weeks ago, just detailing it, and it's fascinating. Like you're just reading about it. I sent some questions to my to the professor at Quantico that has been really helpful. He actually gave me some really good insight onto the logistics of Alexander and analysis of how much grass or pasture land it would take to graze for his military, how to do all these things. 'Cause those kind of details are often left out of of military classics, and sometimes it's a little bit problematic for how we think about what our culminating point would be from a study of logistics. But regardless, Alexander, he takes off from Greece, goes around the Mediterranean, builds a town in Egypt and names it after himself. And then he battles all the way across Israel, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and it's just an epic pursuit of the Persian king Darius. And eventually, he doesn't actually catch him. I think someone else catches Darius, and they kill Darius, and everybody is. Alexander is changing the known world at that time, and he's a very savvy diplomat as well as warrior, and he kind of gives options to the places that he conquers about how they can fold into his empire and be a part of his empire. Assimilation is a big thing that Alexander talks about, and you can still find remnants all across the Middle East from Alexander. But he gets to Afghanistan, and he gets bogged down. And that's so fresh in our mind. Everybody that fought there and everybody that had experiences in Afghanistan. But you can pick up and you can read Alexander the Great, this great captain of history that changed that entire part of the world. But he still nearly culminated in Afghanistan. He was able to get across the Hindu Kush, and he was able to get onto the Indian subcontinent. But his progress up to Afghanistan and then his progress once he gets into Afghanistan is really fascinating to read about. And it's just sometimes it's kind of hard to take it all in because a lot of us have experiences in Afghanistan that are just, I think, to an extent they're difficult to quantify, and how people do quantify them, how people do kind of cope with everything, all the challenges that was Afghanistan. For me, it's looking back on history and just realizing that there was, maybe there is no easy answer, or there definitely is no easy answer in that part of the world, or for some reason between culture and geography and various other causal factors that has been a place that has just stymied militaries for accomplishing their objectives despite their best of intentions, or despite the effort and the sacrifice that's made for again a couple thousand years. But what I also like to read about Alexander on some of the tactical stuff is he crosses this river, and it's just a great story of tactics and of knowing your enemy. And I'll probably butcher this, but it's the Hydaspes River. And so there Alexander is I think it's in Pakistan or around Pakistan, and adversary on the other side, he's got war elephants. And if you've got war elephants, that's like having the ultimate land tank of the time. And so Alexander spends about a week doing all these feints wherever the elephants were, and because he knew his horses wouldn't actually cross, the elephants would scare them about halfway across the river. So instead of pushing all the way across, he's trying to convince the other commander, his adversary, of where he's going to cross. And he has all this activity going on. He's trying to make his army seem bigger than it is, and he's holding these elephants in place while he's taking a small group upstream, and they're scouting around for a place to cross, and eventually finds one. But just the discussion of how much time he spent into knowing the adversary commander, knowing his tactics, knowing his thought process, and anticipating what he was going to do, and then devising a plan to, we call it surfaces and gaps, but to avoid that surface that is the elephant and exploit a gap that was kind of psychological in this case for victory. It's those, you read those examples through history, and as a planner, then I those things are set around in my brain housing group as I'm cooking up plans for whatever it may be, and you start to see opportunities to not do the same thing, but try the same concept or employ the same concept to find the most advantageous way to to secure your victory.
So we're gonna end right here, and today we've gone through a plethora of events and pieces of history that I'm sure that many Marines don't even know about. We've gone over Homer the Iliad, gone over Athens, Spartans, Persians, you name it. Next week we'll be covering, oh my God, Napoleonic era. I hope I'm saying that right.
Mm-hmm.
And the birth of the U.S.
Yep.
And usually around the end of the episodes, I mention a MEB history fact, but you're here, and again, you're quite the historian yourself. You give yourself very little credit, by the way. Do you have any piece of MEB history that you find fascinating?
I mean, when I think of the MEB, I think of Captain Lucas Savage and what he did as far as JTF 505, but I also the Fire Brigade in Korea is an incredible story. The Fire Brigade in Korea, I mean, that's one of those ones that when I think about it, it will still be discussed 2,000 years from now, because from the warning to the deployment of those Marines, they had a week between when they received the order and when they deployed, and they crossed the Pacific Ocean into battle, and they were outnumbered, and they made that voyage onto Pusan, and they held the line, and they set the conditions for the follow-on actions, and the follow-on assault at Incheon. And so I mean, I think that the Fire Brigade, I mean, it's on our logos, but that story is just it's a tremendous example of the capabilities of Marines, and the willingness and the culmination of everything, that all of our ideals and all of our training and all of our discussion about being the most ready when maybe the nation or the situation is the least ready, but that we're ready, and like our lines of effort, that's going back to we were ready, we were relevant, and they were resilient. They accomplished the mission.
That's a good piece. That concludes the third episode of the third MEB podcast. I want to remind everyone again to be safe out in the ocean, and also I want to remind everybody to stay ready, resilient, and relevant. All right, y'all have a great day. I'm out.
If I'm rambling, just like if I say something that maybe I assume is common knowledge, just say, "Hey, wait, time out," or whatever.
So
I'll dive into what I know, and
And I want you to do that because worst case scenario, I'll edit out. Again, I love editing.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many times I had to edit at least like 15 ums for myself at least.
Yeah.
I haven't even really have fun with it yet. Like there's gonna be a time that I'm just gonna on my way out put a long bleep right here.
Yeah.
Be like, sir, I had no idea you had such strong of an opinion about Lawson's versus Family Mart. Like, wow, I don't know why you had to put so many cuss words in there, but okay, fine.
I'm only fluent in 2 languages.